Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast about what's relevant, what's important, and what's meaningful. It's where we address whether the numbers and analytics we see daily are incredibly useful or nearly insignificant. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright, here with Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Bronars, experienced experts who have been analyzing big data since before it was big. Today's topic is one beloved by media. Every month, quarter, and election cycle, it's the unemployment rate. Frankly, it's up there in the pantheon of important statistics, along with the inflation rate, the price of a gallon of milk, and the cost of a Netflix subscription. But not many people seem to know what it is, what it does, or why they shouldn't trust it as much as they do. Steve, this is going to lean heavily on you because the unemployment rate is a little bit of your hobby horse.
It really is.
What is it? And what do people need to know about it? Like,
wait, just to be clear,
yeah.
I mean, I like some unemployment rate too. I mean, it's not just Steve, but yeah, go ahead.
Well, what the unemployment rate measures is the fraction of people who are in the labor force who don't have a job but are actively seeking a job. They've done something in the last month in terms of applying for a job, reaching out to recruiters, something they've been actively looking for it. And so the labor force is really that you add up the number of people who have a job. They might not really be at the job. They could be on vacation or on some leave, but they have a job. And then you add together the people that don't have a job but are actively looking. That's the labor force. And so the unemployment rate is that ratio of the jobless people who are actively looking to the total labor force. And it's about 4% right now.
So there's a bunch of different employment rates we have. There's like 6. You've got to collect them all, I think, in order to master the unemployment rate. But what are the different measures? And I mean, I know one measures people who are actively looking for work, but some of them are partial looking for work. What are the differences between them?
Yeah, I think that there are 6 of them, and the one I described is the one that they most usually quote. That's called U3. But there are ones that are a little bit more inclusive. And
one is specifically for clowns that are looking for work but can't find a job.
Exactly. Yeah, they do sometimes report unemployment rates for subgroups within the population, but they change differently who would be considered in that unemployed group to include people, because there are many people who are neither unemployed or employed. That's the main thing. They're not in the labor force. So if you're in school, if you're retired, if you're home taking care of a family member, you're neither unemployed nor employed.
You're a quantum person.
So that's a big category. But there are people that used to be unemployed, but they're not unemployed right now. So they were looking within the last year, but not within the last month. And they have a very catchy phrase for this group: the marginally attached workers in the labor force. And within that group, there is the discouraged workers, who are the people that gave up looking for work in the last month for certain reasons, like they couldn't, they felt like they couldn't find a job or whatever. So that's one way of expanding it. Another way of expanding it is working, but I have a part-time job and I would really like a full-time job. There's a measure of unemployment. And the unemployment rate that includes that, they're not they're reported every month, but they're not really like the headline number. The headline number is the one that's like, you have to be looking for work in this month, doing something active, and everybody else is not really in the labor force, so they don't enter into the numerator or the denominator.
So why don't we measure things based off of the employment rate? Why don't we ever talk about it that way?
I think that's in many ways a better way to look at it. And it is one of the things that like the Federal Reserve looks at and other economists look at. I'd say one of the big reasons to limit that is the changing age distribution of the population. When people look at the employment rate, they often limit it to what they call prime working age, 25 to 54. There's that number they also put out every month at the BL. When I say
do you balk at that age restriction?
I do.
At it just being 54.
Let me just say this: that right now there are more people age 65 and above who are working than like teenagers.
Yeah,
because the kids don't work hard.
Yeah, because they're a bunch of lazy bums.
If you go back to
because the boomers are right, says Steve Bronars.
Yeah, that's right. When you go back to the mid 1970s, teenagers, in the summer months when they were not in school, made up, 1 out of 9 people in the workforce, in the labor force. It's now less than a third of that, and the labor force participation
less than a third of 1 out of 9. Right.
Yeah, so it's like
it's not less than 1/3.
No.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Just checking.
It went from 11.
We're about getting at numbers right here, Steve.
Well,
so I want to make sure
I wouldn't say
clear.
Less than a third. It's 40%. It's like from 11% to 4%.
Okay.
Type of thing. So I misspoke there. And then for the older folks, it's gone the other direction. Their participation as life expectancy, and also, the jobs aren't as, physically demanding as they used to be, that people tend to hold. So people work longer. So that segment of the population is working more than twice as much as they used to, 65 and above. So it's compared to like the 1970s. So if you don't, look at it by subgroups, you can really be conflating different things if you're looking at the employment ratio. But I think the employment ratio is a very good thing to look at. It's an important thing to look at. But you'd want to know, like, well, who am I looking at? Am I looking at people in middle age, older, younger? So the unemployment rate is just one of many measures that people could be looking at.
I mean, it often gets trotted out as one of the most important statistics that you have during a political season because, of course, people want to tie whatever the unemployment rate is to a picture about the larger economy. If things are good and you don't like, say, the president, then you'll try and downplay them. But if they're bad and you don't like if the numbers are bad and you don't like the president, then it's a sign of economic hardship. How good of a measure is it for the economy? Are there better measures that you should be using?
I think that, it is a reasonable measure, but there's so many other things that are out there in terms of how much are people earning. They'd have a job. That seems kind of important. And when people aren't participating, what are they doing? So there is a measure out there that has become somewhat popular, which is, the acronym is NEET. NEET, which is you're not employed or in education or training. And that's, you look at individuals who are younger, and so the unemployment rate for teens and people in their early 20s, it might be, 7 or 8%, something like that. But, you would hope that they're maybe in school. And so maybe the unemployment rate isn't the be all and end all. But if you look at it and you say, like last year among younger African American men, I think this NEET rate was, something like 19%. So you're not working, you're not in school, you're not getting training, and you're kind of detached from not just the labor force, but just investing in your human capital.
Yeah.
Human capital, that would be a great thing to talk about someday. But
we'll get to that. I mean, that's on the list.
Right. So I do think it really depends on the part of the population that you're talking about, how important the unemployment rate is. Certainly during big recessions, it's going to spike up, and that's going to be an important point. But just because the unemployment rate is 4% doesn't mean everybody's doing well. And so you hear people saying, well, what are people complaining about? The unemployment rate's 4%. That shows a very strong job market. Yes, in some ways, but then there could be other things you could look at that might explain why some people are struggling.
I feel like that's a theme on some of these episodes where we're talking about some kind of number that summarizes something, and then underneath it is a whole bunch of different situations. Some could be good, some could be less good, but it's tough to use that one number to characterize everybody the same way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that historically, it's been a number that they've gathered since like right after World War II. So it was in the like 1947 or so. They started the current population survey.
So as a number, it's also a boomer.
Yes, it's been around a long time, and right now there's a thing called the natural rate of unemployment, or what some economists call the
Maybelline unemployment rate,
the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, NAIRU.
Yes.
And that's kind of what you would expect the unemployment. It's really another catchy name. You expect the unemployment rate to be kind of if you're at what sometimes you would call full employment. The economy's just moving along at a good pace, and that number seems to be lower now than than if you would have asked people like in the 1980s, what's the natural rate of unemployment? What would you consider full employment? An unemployment rate of what? And it's gotten lower, and that's an interesting issue because like the Federal Reserve Board and economists, policymakers are looking at what the unemployment rate is. And even though it's been collected for years and years and years, it seems to be lower now than it was, 20, 30 years ago, even when we're at full employment.
So then, Steve, what would be the policy implications of that lower natural rate of unemployment?
I think that what has happened is as that unemployment rate has come down, it's got people like Jerome Powell and other important policymakers to question maybe there's something else we should be looking at. Maybe we should be looking at the unemployment rate for other groups. We should be looking at some of these employment numbers. So I think the main implication is getting back to what we were talking about before, which is that we have to be looking for other signals of what's happening in the labor market to see whether the economy is heating up or cooling off than just the unemployment rate. Because there are different possible explanations for it, but I think that all that matters is that it's less clear to policymakers that it's a clear signal of what it is that they're trying to tie the policy decisions to.
Well, I think that means that every media outlet now has no excuse for just using the unemployment rate to scare people.
Yeah, and I've got one more question actually for Steve.
I thought you had a question for me. I'd happily answer
questions for you too, of course. What you said about 4%?
Yes.
Is it like 4.0? Is it 4.00?
It's always reported to the nearest 0.1%. That's the convention. And I think that interesting because there are other numbers.
Like what does that convert into if it's the nearest 0.1%?
It depends on what month we're talking about, because it's another thing, they measure it monthly, whereas GDP they only measure quarterly. So every month there's a new number.
Yeah.
And they will report it and say it's 3.9%. That's in recent months it's been 3.8, 3.9, things like that. So that's what they say. And what does that mean? That's measured in the percentage of what I was talking about in terms of the size of the labor force, which is over 160 million people. So 0.1% is 160,000 people. So they're reporting it to the nearest 160,000 person units, which is a pretty broad number, which is very interesting to me because often the BLS will report numbers for jobs growth and stuff to like the nearest 1,000, like 303,000 jobs were created last month or something like that. And so the unemployment rate, the way it's reported, is painted with a much broader brush, 160 times broader than the job creation number. So that's a little bit of an odd thing. I think that the other issue that I think is interesting from a policy point of view is that if it's that important of a number and we think it is going to vary, it's based on a pretty small sample.
They sample 4 people
in the current
America.
We should do an episode about sample size.
In the current population survey, and then you want to report it monthly. But I think if you cared about certain subgroups, it could be a geographic area, it could be people who have less than a high school diploma. It would seem like you would want to, have a more precise measure of what their unemployment rate is, and that's a real challenge because the current population survey, it's about 100,000 households that they survey, and so there's a fair amount of noise in the monthly figures. Probably it would be wise to take some sort of a 3-month average or something like that, because when we're looking at something like GDP, that's big news when the GDP numbers come out. It only comes out 4 times a year, quarterly. And just because they can report something monthly doesn't mean it really was significantly different than it might have been in the previous month, even if the number moves from 3.9 to 3.8. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind about how this is measured.
Well, folks, that's been another episode of Significance. If you're running your economy, make sure that you keep your natural unemployment rate low and don't discourage your workers. Thanks for listening.
Especially the marginally attached.
Yes, the marginally attached. Yes, yeah. Unlike Steve, the marginally attached to reality.
Yeah.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.